In this video, I'm going to explain a little bit more about the rules for the Visual Principles assignment, which is the first large assignment in the beginning graphic design class. There is the visual rules sheet that is located in the learning module, but this video provides further clarification of these rules. So if you feel confused or you want clarity, this is a great place to go. The first rule is hopefully fairly straightforward, and that is that the compositions must be square. So all of your compositions must be square. And this is really easy. As long as you don't modify the template that's provided, you should be fine. But we don't want any rectangular compositions. We don't want to round the corners in any way. We also want to make sure that all of the items within the composition are masked or clipped within the boundary box. So we don't want any elements sticking outside of the box. We also want to make sure there's no more than 7 shapes. So hopefully this again is fairly straightforward. This one has 8 shapes, so it doesn't quite count. This one has quite a few shapes, so it doesn't count either. When we have lines, each segment of the line actually counts. So you are allowed to have line work that zigzags, but each segment of it will count. Black and white shapes count, so you'll notice in this one there's just one too many shapes if you count that white shape. This one can be a little bit confusing, but remember that these compositions by definition in the template are clear. There's no background to them. They're taking on the color of the paper, which is white if you had printed them out. Or when you make a PDF, they're white because that's what they'll look like on paper. So if you decide to change the composition to black, I am assuming that there is a very large circle, triangle, square, line that you have masked inside of the composition. So just know that if it's black, I'm counting that as one of the shapes that you're using. So that's why this one is not correct. You cannot mix elements, so be careful. You don't want lines with planes or points with planes or lines with points. Just make sure that you're isolating the elements when you're working with them. When you're working with planes, you should only be working with perfect triangles, perfect circles, perfect squares. When you're working with lines, everything needs to be a line. So be careful. If it starts to get wider than it is long, it starts to become closer to a rectangle or a plane. So just be careful about that. And then with points, you're only allowed to use circles. So one thing that can get a little bit confusing is the overlap of the circles. They're both used in the points compositions and the plane compositions. So this one is correct as long as it's labeled as a plane composition. But if it was labeled as a point composition, it would not be correct. Hopefully that makes sense and you understand the difference between these two. Another thing I wanted to point out is that you are not required to use all of the planes in your plane compositions. You are welcome to use all 3, but you could also just use squares or just use perfect triangles or just use circles or squares and triangles like you're seeing here. We only want true shapes. So like I said, only perfect squares, perfect triangles, perfect circles. We don't want any rectangles. You could create potentially some of these shapes by stacking squares together. So that is a possibility, but know that then I'm going to count it as multiple items. No ovals. As I said, you're only allowed to use perfect circles, so no ovals. Be careful that none of those circles stretch in any way. You're also only allowed to use perfect equilateral triangles. So that means that all 3 sides of the triangle need to have equal length sides. So no right triangles, no isosceles triangles, no funky weird triangles, only equilateral. So this is where things can get a little bit confusing because in this assignment, you are allowed to overlap black and white shapes. And by doing that, you can create the illusion that you are sometimes breaking the rules. Like this one. You'll notice that this is actually a white circle that is on top of a black circle. These are both perfect circles. This is absolutely acceptable for this assignment. This one too, there's a white square that is overlapping this circle, making it appear as a half circle. And then there's an equilateral triangle right here that has 3 equal sides. But the way it is being covered by the white square is creating the illusion that it's a right triangle. So These things are allowed, but you are not allowed to make these shapes directly. Another trick that's going on here, or an illusion, is that this appears to almost be a large line or rectangle at the bottom of the composition, but you notice when I hover over it, it's actually a large square that is being masked inside of this composition. So you are allowed to mask as well, and that's another way that you can create the illusion of some of these shapes. But just make sure that you are following these rules correctly, because there is some gray area, but it's important to understand that as long as you are overlapping white and black shapes, it is acceptable for this assignment. And again, if you're masking large shapes, that's acceptable as well. All of your compositions must be in black and white. Hopefully that's fairly straightforward, so no color at all, no gray. We're only really looking to see solid black and white shapes. Avoid the Pathfinder tools or any other shape manipulation tools. You're only allowed to create shapes or compositions through overlapping black and white solid shapes. So you are not allowed to use the Pathfinder tool, although we do show you how to mask. It is only really to clip the compositions to fit within the boundary. It is not meant to be used for any kind of shape manipulation at all. So again, avoid the Pathfinder tool, masking, any kind of shape manipulation techniques within Illustrator, except for masking to create your compositions to fit within the boundary box, the squares that are provided. But you'll notice here that you can create interesting compositions, weird shapes through just simple layering. So that's all through the Arrange menu, which you'll learn about in the software tutorial. And these are absolutely correct, and they work for this assignment. So as I kind of hinted at, you're only allowed to use solid shapes. So no stroke, that means no outline shapes at all. So you notice in this first one, this is incorrect. Everything has to be solid. Same with these. These are circles that are layered on top of each other and they're all outlined. You'll notice they're lines, they're not solid. Everything has to be solid shapes like these squares. These are acceptable, but unfortunately this stroked rectangle makes it incorrect. One, because it's using an outline, but two, also because it is a rectangle. This is correct though. So this is another one of those illusions or, tricks to this assignment that come from the layering of these shapes. These are two circles that are layered on top of each other, one black and one white, and they are centered perfectly on top of each other, creating the illusion that there is a solid, thick black stroke. And this is absolutely acceptable for this assignment. And you'll notice that I can even control the width of that stroke by making that interior white shape larger or smaller. So this is acceptable, but also keep in mind that if you do this, I am going to count this as two separate shapes. Same thing's going on here. These are squares that are layered on top of each other, creating the illusion that there's some kind of stroke or outline being used. But again, it's just squares that are layered on top of each other. So those things are absolutely correct, but no stroke. So hopefully you understand the difference between this composition and this composition. You are also not allowed to use any imagery. For this assignment, we are restricting you to deal with abstract communication. So we don't want any references to symbols or suns, smiley faces, trees, forests, mountain scenes. You do not want to reference anything in the real world. Everything needs to remain abstract. That is really the challenge of this assignment and the challenge of being a graphic designer. And that's really what we're asking you to do here, is handle abstract communication. So again, no pictorial references, no imagery at all. And lastly, you're only allowed to use straight lines. So no wavy lines, no curved lines of any kind, no tapered lines. You are allowed to create zigzag lines or really any line compositions you would like to create as long as they're all straight. They can make other shapes or combine in different ways, but every straight segment of a line that I see, I will count as a separate line. So just keep that in mind. So hopefully that helps you, some clarification on these rules if you were a little bit confused. As I mentioned, we do grade very strictly on the rules. That's what this assignment is about. It's about following directions and working within these constraints. So that's why it's really important that I want to make sure they're clear. If you do have any questions, about this assignment, the rules, or anything, please do email your instructor. They're there to help you. And good luck on the assignment.